Adding to our list of Democratic presidential contenders who are responding now, California Democrat Kamala Harris, who spoke to our own Vaughn Hilliard just a few moments ago. Take a listen.
Criminal prosecution of a sitting president would unconstitutionally undermine the capacity of the executive branch to perform its constitutionally assigned functions. Should that be DOJ policy? And should the special counsel have sought to charge President Trump with obstruction of justice?
All right, so look, I think what we are clear about is that we learned a few things today. And most importantly, what we learned is that the special counsel did not return an indictment because of that memo. In other words, but for that memo, I believe a fair inference from what we heard from Bob Mueller is that there would have been indictments returned against this president. And the other thing we learned today is that the current Attorney General of the United States misled the American people when he spoke about his conversation with Bob Mueller and suggested that Bob Mueller said no, it had nothing to do with but for that memo. There wasn't enough there. So these are the issues that are now, I think, very clear. And the bottom line is, one, we have got to now let the process, start its course around Congress acting on what we know is essentially indictable evidence and information.
Should it be policy, DOJ policy, the inability to indict a sitting president?
I think that if I were president, I would ask and hope that the Attorney General and an Attorney General who actually had justice in mind instead of covering up for the president, I would hope and ask that she would put in place a procedure of questioning whether that memo is actually necessary and applicable when we have a situation such as this. Because after all, remember, it's an advisory memo. It's not the law.
Senator, what was the message that Mr. Mueller was sending to you, a sitting member of Congress? And do you have a reaction to the president's tweet saying that this case is closed and nothing has changed?
Well, I try not to respond to those tweets, but I will say that I think what is clear is that I think it's a fair inference from what we heard in that press conference that Bob Mueller was essentially referring impeachment to the United States Congress.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Kamala Harris, upstate South Carolina, on the heels of that town hall last night here on MSNBC. Just a few minutes here left. We'll come back out to you here, Brett, for a moment. Is that what you heard from Bob Mueller? Was he calling on Congress to essentially do something?
Well, he was saying that this is not in my hands, it's in Congress's hands. I don't know. I mean, the statement was somewhat, I guess, oracular is the word. Do something can also mean doing nothing, laying it to rest. I mean, he made it clear that he was not exonerate, that the report did not exonerate the president. But there's a great question as to then what that do something ought to be, and there are a range of options before the Congress, by the way, which are not simply impeachment or doing nothing. There's also such a thing as censure, which is one of the things that Democrats were recommending against President Clinton 21 years ago during the saga of his own impeachment. So this is a judgment that's both legal as well as political that only the Congress itself can determine. I mean, if I were offering Democrats in Congress advice, to the extent that they take it, I'd say censure is a good bet because it allows a lot of Republicans to get on record censuring the president without ending up in an impeachment process that might end up helping him politically.
Bret Stephens, we're going to have to leave it there. Big thanks to you. Big thanks to all of my guests and panelists.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.